Hey there, welcome to Mr. Cozy Bedtime True Crime Stories. Tonight, we're diving into 2 hours of gripping true crime cases. Real stories of mystery, betrayal, and cold-blooded crimes, all set against the soothing backdrop of rain. It's the perfect blend of calm and unsettling. If these cases draw you in, tap that like button, share with your fellow true crime lovers, and subscribe to join our curious community. I'm always wondering, where are you tuning in from, and what time is it for you right now? Drop it in the comments below. Now settle in, and let's dig into the darkness. Story 1. There are some stories that arrive in the news and stop the world for a moment. Not because they are complicated in their facts, but because they are unbearable in their meaning. The case of Clayton Dietz is one of those stories. It took place in a small, quiet Pennsylvania town on a night that should have been filled with nothing more serious than birthday cake and the ordinary rituals of childhood. Instead, it ended with a 42-year-old man dead in his bed, an 11-year-old boy in handcuffs, and an entire community struggling to understand how something so unthinkable could have taken root in such an ordinary house on such an ordinary street. To understand what happened in the early morning hours of January 13th, 2026, in Duncannon, Pennsylvania, you have to understand first what Duncannon is. And then you have to sit with the fact that it matters not at all that it is quiet and small, and the kind of place where neighbors are surprised by violent things, because violent things do not ask for permission before they arrive. Duncannon is a borough in Perry County, Pennsylvania, tucked along the western bank of the Susquehanna River roughly 20 miles north of Harrisburg, the state capital. It is a town of a few thousand people, with the kind of main street that has seen better economic days, but still carries the structure of a community that knows itself. A post office, a diner, churches with well-kept lawns, neighborhoods of modest homes where people have lived for generations. On the first block of South Market Street, within this quiet geography, the Dietz family made their home. Douglas Dietz was 42 years old, a man whose life centered on family and routine. He had a wife named Jillian, and together they had adopted a boy named Clayton in 2018, when the child was still very young. Adoption is, at its foundation, an act of profound commitment, the deliberate choice to extend a family, to give a child a home, to take responsibility for a life that needs shelter and love and the particular steadiness that a stable household provides. Douglas and Jillian had made that choice. They had brought Clayton into their family when he was small, and they had raised him through the years that followed. By January 2026, Clayton was about to turn 11. He was a child in the way that all children are children, growing, difficult, capable of joy and frustration in equal measure, navigating the complicated inner world of early adolescence with the limited emotional tools that 11 years of living provides. He loved video games the way that most children his age loved video games, with an intensity that adults often struggle to remember and sometimes forget entirely how to take seriously. January 12th, 2026 was a Monday evening, unremarkable in every external way. Douglas and Jillian and Clayton were at home, moving through the ordinary rhythms of a weekday night. Sometime that evening, a conflict arose, the kind of conflict that happens in households everywhere, with a frequency so common it barely registers as an event. Clayton had been playing on his Nintendo Switch, the handheld gaming console that had become, for him, the center of a significant amount of his leisure time, and Douglas had taken it away. The reason for the confiscation was not unusual. Clayton was being told it was time for bed. Douglas took the device and told his son that the night was over. For most children on most nights, this ends in sullenness, perhaps a slammed door, perhaps a few minutes of protest before the exhaustion of the day takes over and sleep arrives. What happened instead, in the hours that followed inside that home on South Market Street, was something that no parenting manual has ever adequately prepared a family for. What is known from the court documents and law enforcement records reviewed by multiple news outlets is that Clayton did not simply go to sleep. At some point after being sent to bed, while the house was quiet and his parents had settled in for the night, While Jillian would later tell investigators she and Douglas had barely made it past midnight before singing their son a birthday song. Just after the clock had ticked from the 12th into the 13th, Clayton began looking for his Nintendo Switch. He did not find it in the obvious places, and so he kept searching. What Clayton found in the course of his search was not the gaming console. What he found in his father's drawer was a small key. The Dietz home contained a gun safe, a locked metal cabinet of the kind that responsible gun owners use to store firearms away from children, away from accidents, away from the casual reach of hands that should not hold weapons. Douglas kept a revolver in that safe. The key to the safe was stored in his drawer, perhaps because he felt it was secure enough there, perhaps because he had never imagined a scenario in which the child he had adopted, the boy he had raised, would be looking through his belongings at 3 in the morning. Clayton, 11 years old on the first minutes of his birthday, took the key from the drawer. He went to the gun safe. He unlocked it. He removed the revolver from inside. Then he loaded it. Then he pulled back the hammer. What would happen next? Whether that absence of consideration was the honest confession of a child whose emotional regulation had simply failed in a way no one had anticipated, or whether it was something else, something shaped by the particular history of a boy who had come into this family, already carrying whatever a young life carries before it is taken in by new parents, is a question that would eventually be for courts, and perhaps for psychologists and advocates to explore. In the early morning hours of January 13th, 2026, Clayton Dietz walked into his parents' bedroom. Douglas was asleep. Clayton fired the revolver once, at point-blank range, into his father's head. Jillian Dietz woke to a sound she could not immediately identify. In the half-consciousness of middle-of-the-night confusion, the noise registered as something loud and abrupt, and then her brain began filling in the silence that followed. She said it smelled faintly like fireworks, the acrid sulfur-tinged smell of a discharge that most people only encounter in open air, on the 4th of July, when it means something celebratory and innocent. In a bedroom at 3 in the morning, it meant something else entirely. She reached over and nudged Douglas. He did not stir. She nudged him again. He did not move. And then, in the terrible logic of a brain trying to reconcile what her senses were telling her with what she was willing to accept as real, she heard it, a slow, rhythmic dripping. She heard as the sound of water. She turned on the light. What she saw told her everything. Douglas Dietz, her husband of years, her son's adoptive father, the man who had taken the Nintendo Switch away from a boy who needed to go to sleep on a school night, was dead. The dripping was not water. Pennsylvania State Police were called to the home at approximately 3 in the morning. Troopers arrived to find Douglas Dietz on his back on the bedroom floor, with an apparent gunshot wound to the head. The house was quiet. The revolver was accounted for. Investigators spoke with Jillian in the kitchen, and as that conversation unfolded, one of the troopers reported hearing something that no one in that kitchen would ever forget. From somewhere nearby, a child's voice said the words, "I killed Daddy." Clayton Dietz was taken into custody within hours. He was charged with criminal homicide, because Pennsylvania law mandated that homicide charges be filed in adult court. He was charged as an adult, making him, at 11 years old, one of the youngest people in recent American history to face adult murder charges. Bail was denied. He was remanded to Perry County Prison. It was his birthday. Investigators who interviewed Clayton in the hours after the shooting found a child who was both deeply distressed and, in certain moments, strikingly honest. When troopers asked him what he had thought would happen when he fired the gun, he told them he had been angry and that he had not considered the consequences. When asked whether he had someone in mind when he took the weapon, he said yes. He told police he had gone through the entire sequence, finding the key, unlocking the safe, loading the revolver, pulling back the hammer, with deliberate action. And then, in the kitchen of his family home, while his mother sat nearby in a state of devastation that defied description, he said, "I killed my dad. I hate myself." Investigators also noted something else when they arrived at the scene. Clayton Dietz had a large bruise above his left eye and a small laceration on his lower lip. The existence of these injuries, recorded in the official affidavit, opened a door of context that the documents themselves did not fully explain, and that the public record, at this stage, has not resolved. Whether those injuries were related to the events of that night, whether they spoke to something in the household's history, or whether they had an entirely unrelated explanation, was not established in the initial reporting. But they were there, documented, a detail that defense attorneys and the court system would eventually be required to examine and account for in full. What the community saw in the days that followed was a neighborhood in shock. A neighbor who spoke to a local television reporter said they had not expected anything like this to happen on their street. Perry County, a rural area of rolling hills and modest towns, was not a place accustomed to homicide trials, and it was certainly not accustomed to seeing an 11-year-old child arrive at a courthouse in handcuffs. On February 19, 2026, 5 weeks and 6 days after the shooting, Clayton Dietz was transported to the Perry County Courthouse in New Bloomfield for his first formal court appearance. He arrived just after noon, wearing clothes that looked too large on a frame still small with childhood, and he was handcuffed, surrounded by probation officers and visibly struggling. A reporter present outside the courthouse observed him tripping over himself as he walked. Inside, a trooper heard him tell his mother quietly that the handcuffs were hurting him. The hearing that day was a preliminary hearing, a proceeding in which a judge evaluates whether there is sufficient evidence for a case to proceed. Clayton, through his attorney, waived that hearing. The case was marked as waived for court, meaning it would move forward to the Court of Common Pleas, where the more serious legal proceedings would take place. His attorney, Dave Wilson, spoke to reporters after the hearing with a clarity that cut through the procedural language of the legal system and landed on the human reality at the center of everything. My goal is going to be to try to get him into juvenile court. That sentence contained, compressed within it, the entire philosophical weight of what this case had come to represent. The American criminal justice system draws a line between adults and children not merely as a matter of administrative convenience, but because it recognizes that children's brains are not fully formed, that their capacity for judgment and foresight and emotional regulation is fundamentally different from that of adults, and that the purpose of the law when it deals with children should include the possibility of rehabilitation, not merely the imposition of punishment. In Pennsylvania, criminal homicide charges filed against a defendant of any age automatically begin in adult court. To move Clayton's case to juvenile court, where the system's focus would be on treatment, rehabilitation, and supervised care rather than incarceration in a facility built for adult criminals, Wilson would have to petition the court and present arguments sufficient to persuade a judge that the interests of justice and of the child would be better served there. Advocates who work in juvenile justice were vocal in their response to the case. They pointed out that the differences between adult incarceration and juvenile detention for a child of 11 were not merely procedural. An 11-year-old placed in an adult facility faces a reality entirely different from one placed in a youth facility. Different in terms of safety, education, mental health access, and the fundamental structure of the environment around them. The trajectory of the two paths, they argued, diverged enormously from the very first day. The Dietz family, in the weeks after the shooting, maintained a silence that was at once understandable and agonizing. Jillian Dietz had, in the space of a single night, lost her husband and watched her son taken away in handcuffs, and had found herself living in a story that no one has a language for. The grief of a wife who has lost a husband to violence is one of the most documented forms of human sorrow. The grief of a mother watching the child she raised be placed in state custody for that same violence is something almost entirely without a map. She said nothing publicly. Her family said nothing. Douglas's family said nothing. The lawyers said what lawyers are trained to say. And Clayton, sitting somewhere in the Perry County prison on a cold February day, wearing handcuffs that hurt his wrists, had already said the only words that felt entirely his. I killed my dad. I hate myself. Those words, reported in multiple court documents confirmed by investigators, echoed in the reporting of nearly every outlet that covered the case, contained a kind of devastation that legal charges and criminal proceedings are not built to hold. They are the words of a child who did something he cannot undo, who already knew in the moment after pulling the trigger that the world had changed irreversibly, who had no adult vocabulary for the rage that had led him there and no child vocabulary for the grief that followed. As of February 2026, the case of Clayton Dietz remained ongoing. He was charged as an adult with criminal homicide in the death of Douglas Dietz. His attorney was working to move the case to juvenile court. No trial date had been set. No verdict had been reached. The full context of the family's history, including the nature of Clayton's upbringing before his adoption, the circumstances of his life between 2018 and 2026, and the meaning of the bruises documented on his face the night of the shooting, was part of a legal record that had not yet been made fully public. What was public was the following: a 42-year-old man was dead. An 11-year-old boy was in prison. A mother was living in the gap between those two facts. A neighborhood was quietly trying to absorb what had happened. And a legal system was being asked to do something it has never been particularly good at: hold a child accountable for a devastating act while also holding space for the possibility that the child himself was shaped by forces larger than any single night of anger and a confiscated Nintendo Switch. That last sentence is important, and it deserves to be said carefully. Nothing in this account should be read as a dismissal of the life of Douglas Dietz, or as a minimization of what was taken from him and from everyone who loved him on the night of January 13th, 2026. He was a man who had chosen to bring a child into his family. He had raised that child for years. He was 42 years old and should have had decades more ahead of him. He deserved to grow old. That he did not, that he died in his own bed on the night of his son's birthday of a gunshot wound to the head, is a tragedy without qualification. But the case of Clayton Dietz is also the story of a child who had already been, at some point in his earliest years, a person in need of adoption, a child whose inner world in the years between then and now is largely unknown to the public, a child who is 11 years old and sitting in a prison, and who told his mother he hated himself before the morning was even fully light. That is also a tragedy without qualification. The American legal system will decide, eventually, in what forum and under what framework Clayton Dietz will be judged. The outcome of that decision will shape not just his life, but the public conversation about how we, as a society, respond when children do the most unthinkable things, when the violence we associate with adult failure appears instead in small hands, on a birthday, in a house on a quiet street in a small town where neighbors say they never expected something like this to happen. They never do. That is perhaps the most honest thing about all of it. No one ever expects it. And yet, with a terrible and recurring regularity, it arrives anyway, and leaves behind in its wake a family that has no words, a community that has no framework, and a court system being asked to find justice in a place where justice, in any full sense, may simply be impossible. Story 2. There are mornings in Florida that feel like grace itself. The air holds a particular quality just before dawn, cool and clean and sweet with the smell of pine and lake water, that makes a man feel as if everything important and good in the world is still intact. On the morning of December 16, 2000, a Saturday, Jerry Michael Williams, known to everyone who loved him simply as Mike, rose in the dark while his wife and young daughter still slept, hitched his boat to his truck, and drove toward one of those mornings. He was 31 years old, in good health. At the peak of a career he had worked himself nearly into the ground to build, and deeply in love with the little girl who had come into his life just the year before. He was the kind of man who made everyone around him feel like things were going to be all right. He drove toward Lake Seminole, a vast, quiet reservoir straddling the Georgia-Florida border, roughly 50 miles west of his home in Tallahassee. He had been hunting those waters since he was 15 years old. He knew the lake, its coves, its silences, the places where the ducks gathered in the early light. He did not know, could not have known, that someone he trusted had already decided this would be the last morning of his life. He kissed the world goodbye without knowing it, and then he drove into the dark, and into the trap that had been carefully and coldly built for him by two people who had been smiling at him for years. Mike Williams grew up in Bradfordville, north of Tallahassee, in the kind of household where sacrifice and love were the same word. His father drove a Greyhound bus, and his mother ran a day care out of their double-wide trailer. Rather than building a more comfortable home for themselves, Mike's parents chose to save that money, so their two boys, Mike and his older brother Nick, could attend North Florida Christian High School, a private school that gave them a foundation in both faith and ambition. Mike repaid that investment 100-fold. He became student council president, played football, was voted best personality by his classmates, and threw himself into everything he did with an intensity that others found both inspiring and slightly exhausting. He discovered duck hunting at 15, and it became one of the great pleasures of his life. An early morning ritual, a communion with stillness and nature, a way of stepping out of the fast pace of everything else. He attended Florida State University, where he studied political science and urban planning, but before he even graduated, he was hired by Ketchum Appraisal Group as a property appraiser. His employer Clay Ketchum would later describe him as the hardest working man he had ever seen. It was not uncommon for Mike to work 15-hour days, going home in the evenings to have dinner with his family, and then returning to the office late into the night, or heading to the lake at dawn and arriving at his desk before most people had finished their first cup of coffee. By the year 2000, he was earning approximately $200,000 a year, remarkable for a man his age, in a profession that rewarded diligence above almost anything else. He had also, in high school, met a girl named Denise Merrill, popular, polished, a cheerleader, voted best dressed by her own classmates. They reconnected and married in 1994, when Mike was 24. In 1999, their daughter Ansley arrived, and by all outward appearances, Mike Williams had everything. He adored his daughter, was devoted to his wife, was planning another child, and had already spoken to his mother and his brother just 2 days before he disappeared about the future he was building. A cruise to Hawaii in the spring, a work trip to Jamaica, another baby on the way. The world was opening up before him like a long, well-lit road. What Mike did not know, what perhaps the most devastating part of this story depends upon, was that for at least 3 years before he disappeared, his wife had been carrying on a secret affair with his best friend. Brian Winchester had grown up knowing Denise since they were children. He had come back into her orbit as an adult, becoming close to her, and by extension close to Mike as well. The three of them spent time together, double-dated, shared holidays. Winchester was one of the people who had organized the search effort when Mike failed to return from the lake, driving out to the rural boat launch with his father to look for his friend's truck. He was the same man who, a few months before Mike disappeared, had sold him a $1 million life insurance policy. He was the smiling, dependable best friend, the man you'd call in a crisis, the man you trusted without thinking about it because trust had become second nature between you. And all of that time, while Mike built his life, worked his 15-hour days, and loved his daughter, Brian Winchester and Denise Williams were planning to take that life from him. Not in a moment of passion, not in a rage, but slowly, methodically, over months of quiet conversation, rejected plans, and calculated patience. Winchester would later confess in extraordinary detail that the affair had begun in 1997 and had, in his own words, simply snowballed. Denise, he said, did not want a divorce. Her family's religious convictions made that path deeply uncomfortable, and there was the matter of her daughter, whom she feared losing custody of in any separation. The solution they arrived at, in the chilling logic of their shared recklessness, was that Mike had to die. They considered a staged boating accident in the Gulf of Mexico, where both Mike and Winchester's own wife, Kathy Thomas, would be thrown overboard, but Winchester drew a line at killing the mother of his children. They considered a staged robbery at Mike's office. Each plan was turned over, examined, and set aside for another. It was Winchester who eventually hit upon the idea of a hunting accident. He had been duck hunting with Mike in Arkansas earlier that year and had watched his friend nearly drown in quicksand before he pulled him to safety. He had seen, in that moment of near catastrophe, exactly what Mike looked like when his life was in danger. He filed it away and began to build the plan. When Mike left home in the pre-dawn darkness of December 16, 2000, the plan was already in motion. Winchester had arranged to be at the lake. The location chosen was a remote, undeveloped boat launch, muddy, out of the way, far from the concrete launches Mike was known to use. This detail, small and seemingly unremarkable, would later strike investigators as profoundly strange. Mike Williams was an experienced, safety-conscious hunter who kept his guns locked away from his daughter and who followed water safety practices as though they were commandments. He would never have worn his waders while operating a boat. He always waited until he reached the point where he intended to get out and hunt on foot. Every friend who ever hunted with him said the same thing. But that morning, according to the testimony Winchester would give nearly 2 decades later, Mike was convinced to put his waders on while still out on the water. Winchester then pushed him out of the boat, fully intending that the weight of the water-filled waders would pull Mike beneath the surface of the lake, and that he would drown in the cold, dark water without anyone to help him. It did not go as planned. Mike, even in those desperate seconds, found the strength to fight. He managed to swim to a nearby tree stump, one of the many that protruded from the silted floor of the area known locally as Stump Field, and clung to it, gasping alive. In that moment, the carefully constructed plan of a drowning accident collapsed completely. A drowning accident had become impossible to stage. What happened next was not an accident at all. Winchester fired a single shotgun blast directly into Mike Williams's face at close range. Then he buried the body. He cleaned out Mike's truck and, on the same evening that he deposited his best friend into the cold ground, he attended a family Christmas party. It was there that he learned a search for the missing man had already begun. When Denise told her father at noon that day that Mike had not returned from his hunting trip, the wheels of an innocent-seeming search began to turn. Winchester's own father drove with Brian to the lake, and together they located Mike's 1994 Ford Bronco near the remote boat launch. The Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission was called, and investigators arrived to find the kind of scene that reads as a straightforward tragedy. An abandoned boat drifting roughly 225 feet from the boat ramp, a shotgun still in its case sitting untouched on the deck, and no sign of the man who had brought it. No one at that early stage considered that a crime had taken place. Why would they? A man had gone duck hunting alone on a lake full of stumps and alligators, hadn't come home, and his empty boat had been found. The logic of the situation seemed to write its own explanation. Investigators theorized that Mike had hit a stump, been thrown from the boat, and drowned with his waders filling with water, pulling him under before he could free himself. It was tragic, but it was comprehensible, the kind of thing that happened to hunters who took risks. What no one could explain was the body. In a lake that had recorded nearly 80 known drowning deaths, every single victim had eventually surfaced. Investigators told the Williams family that Mike's body would float to the surface within 3 to 7 days, perhaps a little longer given the cold front that had swept in. 3 days passed. 7 days passed. 3 weeks passed. Then 4. The water temperature dropped to barely 46 degrees. Ice formed along the shoreline, reaching 20 feet out in some places. Searchers lit fires in steel drums to stay warm along the banks. They used long PVC poles to probe the lake bottom, learning to distinguish between the thump of a submerged log and the soft give of a human body. Cadaver dogs were brought in. A helicopter searched from above. Nothing. After 44 days, the search was called off. The explanation that took hold in the absence of a body was one that would shadow the investigation for years: alligators. The lake was famous for them. Early in the search, one of Mike's friends had counted 15 to 20 large alligators swimming in the immediate vicinity of the search area. Private search experts concluded that the lake's wildlife, gators, turtles, catfish, might have consumed and scattered the remains. It was a disturbing theory, but in the void of any other answer, it was accepted by many as the most probable explanation. Denise Williams held a memorial service for her husband the day after the search ended. The things that did not add up. Cheryl Williams, Mike's mother, did not believe a word of it. She was not a woman with connections in law enforcement. She ran a daycare out of her home in Bradfordville, the same community where she had raised her sons. But she had known her boy all his life, and the picture being painted, her careful, safety-conscious son wearing waders in a moving boat, alone, in a cove he would not normally have used, launching from a muddy patch of shoreline when he had always used the concrete launches nearby. None of it fit the man she had raised. She began taking notes. She talked to his friends. She ran advertisements in local newspapers. She put up billboards. She investigated alone in the margins of her days because she had no other choice. Meanwhile, 6 months after Mike vanished, a fisherman found a pair of waders floating in the lake, and divers recovered a hunting jacket from the bottom, along with a flashlight. In one of the jacket pockets was a hunting license bearing Mike's name and signature. At first glance, it seemed like confirmation of the drowning theory, but investigators who examined the items were troubled by what they saw. The waders had no tooth marks on them, no evidence of any animal. The jacket and flashlight were in far too good a condition for items that had supposedly been submerged in a Florida lake for 6 months. The flashlight still worked. There was no DNA evidence connecting the clothing to Mike at all. The items had the look, to those willing to see it, of something planted. But that suspicion, without evidence, was worth nothing. A Leon County judge declared Mike Williams legally dead on the basis of the recovered items, accepting the theory that alligators had consumed his body completely. Within days of that ruling, Denise Williams filed claims on her husband's life insurance policies. He had taken out approximately $2 million in total coverage. She collected. 5 years later, she married Brian Winchester, who had sold Mike the policies. They moved into the same house where Mike and Denise had lived during their marriage. The years passed, and the case stalled and restarted and stalled again. In 2004, Cheryl Williams finally persuaded the Florida Department of Law Enforcement to reopen the investigation. What FDLE investigators found, as they looked closely at the facts of December 16, 2000, was a growing list of things that simply made no sense. The boat launch Mike had used was a muddy, undeveloped patch of shoreline, when he was known to use finished concrete launches nearby. The boat's engine had been found switched off, with a full tank of gas, but experts noted that if the engine had been running when Mike allegedly fell overboard, as the original theory required, it should have continued running in circles until the fuel was exhausted. Something or someone had turned it off. The storm that moved in the night after Mike disappeared had westerly winds that should have pushed an unmoored, drifting boat across the lake toward Georgia, not left it floating 225 feet from the ramp on the Florida side. And the alligators. Investigators consulted a local herpetologist named Mataresco, who told them in plain terms that alligators do not feed during winter months. Water temperatures in the lake had dropped to 46 degrees during the search period, and some nights saw temperatures below freezing. In those conditions, he said, it was highly unlikely that any alligator would have been active at all, let alone aggressive enough to fully consume the body of a 170-pound adult man. It would be very, very unusual to have the complete disappearance of a full-grown man, Oresco said. Investigator Ronnie Austin, working with the FDLE, put it bluntly. My gut feeling is Mike did not die in Lake Seminole. But gut feelings, without evidence, cannot produce arrests. Without a body, without a crime scene, and with the original scene having been completely contaminated by the 44-day search, investigators were hitting a wall from every direction. The DIF, Florida's Division of Insurance Fraud, opened its own investigation in 2008, noting the suspicious timing of the life insurance purchases, the suspicious omissions in Denise's petition to have Mike declared dead, and the suspicious speed with which she had filed her claims. By the 8th anniversary of Mike's disappearance, that investigation too had closed. We have suspicions, but what we need is evidence, said the DIF's lead attorney, Mark Schlein. Cheryl Williams, by now, had filled 27 single-spaced pages with notes. She had written over 200 letters, one per day, to Florida's governor, asking for intervention. She later discovered that every single one of those letters had been forwarded, unopened, to the same agency she was asking for help against. She said it felt like being punched in the face. She kept going anyway. By 2012, something had begun to fracture inside Brian Winchester's marriage to Denise. By 2015, she had filed for divorce. Winchester fought it bitterly, not, as it would later become clear, because of love, but because of fear. The closer the divorce drew, the more desperate he became, terrified that a woman who was now his adversary knew exactly what had happened on a cold December morning at Lake Seminole 15 years before. On August 5, 2016, as Denise drove to her job at Florida State University, she felt movement in the back seat of her car. Someone had been hiding there. It was Brian Winchester, holding a gun. He took her phone, shouted directions at her, and refused to let her go until she drove where he wanted. She pulled into a CVS parking lot close to the entrance doors, a small, quiet act of survival instinct. He told her he was going to kill himself, that he had nothing to live for, that he could not lose her. She talked him down, drove him back to his own vehicle, and despite a promise she made in the moment, drove directly to the police. Winchester was arrested and charged with kidnapping and related felonies. In December 2017, he was sentenced to 20 years in prison. The very next day, the FDLE held a press conference and announced to a stunned gathering of reporters that the remains of Jerry Michael Williams had been found, and that his death had been ruled a homicide. The FDLE had, in fact, received information about the location of Mike's body weeks earlier, in October 2017. What followed was an operation of extraordinary quiet intensity. County Public Works employees were brought in under the guise of a training exercise. For 5 consecutive 16-hour days, workers operated backhoes at the end of a dead-end road called Gardner Road in northern Leon County, just 5 miles from where Mike Williams had grown up. They dug 9-foot holes into the mud, holding back the encroaching lake waters with dams and pumps, working in the constant company of eels and water moccasins, before eventually bringing in a private contractor to continue. On October 18th, search dogs and officers finally found what they had been looking for: skeletal remains, buried deep in piles of excavated earth stacked on plywood sheets. 98% of Mike Williams's bones were recovered, remarkably well preserved, along with clothing including winter gloves and booties. DNA testing confirmed a match to his mother's sample. And then, with heartbreaking precision, forensic evidence confirmed what the lake had concealed for 17 years. Mike Williams had been shot in the face at point-blank range with a shotgun. He had not drowned. He had not been taken by alligators. He had been murdered. Cheryl Williams had been right all along. On May 8, 2018, as Denise Williams left her job at Florida State University to take her daughter to celebrate her 19th birthday, FDLE agents were waiting. She was arrested on charges of first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit first-degree murder, and accessory after the fact. Her attorney said she was innocent of everything, that Brian Winchester had acted alone, and that his client had nothing whatsoever to do with her first husband's death. The trial began in December 2018, and what emerged from the witness stand over 4 days was a story that rearranged everything the jury thought they understood. Brian Winchester, the man who had buried Mike Williams in the mud, the man who had pulled the trigger, the man serving 20 years for kidnapping his own ex-wife, took the stand as the prosecution's central witness and began to speak. He described the affair with Denise in full. He described the years of planning. He described the rejected ideas, the Gulf of Mexico drowning, the staged robbery, and explained how each had been set aside. He described the morning of December 16, 2000, in detail so specific that the courtroom fell into a kind of horrified silence. He had enticed Mike out to the lake. He had convinced him to put the waders on. He had pushed him overboard, expecting him to drown. He described how Mike had defied the odds, had fought through the freezing water, and had managed to pull himself onto a tree stump. And then he described raising the shotgun. One shot, close range, into Mike's face. He described how he had buried the body that same day, cleaned the truck, and gone to a Christmas party where someone told him that searchers had already begun looking for his best friend. Prosecutors also played a recorded phone conversation in which Winchester's first wife, Kathy Thomas, working with police, had told Denise that she knew the truth. Every time the subject came up, Denise tried to change the direction of the conversation, but at one point the words slipped through. "What do you know?" the jury heard her say. The prosecution told them that Denise's calm, calculating composure when Winchester described to her how he had killed her husband showed not the shock of an innocent woman, but the coldness of someone who had already known. The defense argued that there was no physical evidence connecting Denise to the murder, and that Winchester, the man who had actually pulled the trigger, was not the one on trial. It was a powerful point, but it was not enough. After 4 days of testimony and 8 hours of deliberation, the jury convicted Denise Williams on all 3 counts. In February 2019, she was sentenced to life in prison. She stood silent before the judge, offering nothing, no statement, no expression of remorse, no acknowledgement of what had been taken. The only person who addressed the court, beyond the lawyers, was Cheryl Williams. She told the judge and the jury in the room that justice had finally been served, and that Denise had not only taken her son from her, she had taken her granddaughter, too, by weaponizing access to the child against a grieving grandmother who refused to stop asking what had really happened to her boy. The legal story did not end there. In November 2020, a Florida appellate court overturned Denise Williams's murder conviction, finding on technical grounds that the evidence was insufficient to sustain that particular charge, but upheld the conspiracy conviction and the 30-year sentence that came with it. Florida's Attorney General appealed the reversal to the state Supreme Court, which declined to hear the case. As of the time of writing, Denise Williams remains imprisoned at the Florida Women's Reception Center, serving those 30 years. Brian Winchester, the man who physically committed the murder, received no additional charges in connection with Mike's death. He remains imprisoned on the kidnapping conviction, serving his 20-year sentence. And in a moment of quiet, painful justice, Mike and Denise's daughter Ansley, the little girl her father had adored, who had been just 1 year old when he was taken from her, was awarded her late father's estate and the insurance proceeds that had once been paid to his killer. Denise signed them over to avoid additional fraud charges. The terms of the arrangement specified that Ansley could not use a single dollar of that money to fund her mother's legal defense. Mike Williams was given a proper burial in September 2018, 18 years after the morning he drove toward the lake and never came home. His mother, Cheryl, the woman who had spent nearly 2 decades writing letters no one opened, posting billboards no one answered, and carrying the weight of a truth that no one in power seemed willing to look for, stood beside her son's grave and said what she had always believed, that he was a Christian man, that he had been in heaven all those years, that what she was burying was only his earthly remains, that it was the least she could do for her child. Mike Williams was 31 years old when he was murdered on a cold December morning by 2 people who smiled at him while they planned it. He had done nothing to deserve it, was guilty of nothing except trusting the people who were closest to him, and left behind a mother who loved him enough to spend the best years of her life making sure the world eventually knew his name. In the end, she gave him back his truth. That is a kind of devotion that outlasts everything. It outlasted the lies, the money, the silence, and the years. It outlasted the lake itself. Story 3. In the heart of Singapore's Orchard Road, where neon lights and bustling crowds painted a picture of modern prosperity, a small house behind the Presbyterian church stood as a quiet counterpoint. It was here, in 1984, that Ayakano Maramuthu, a 34-year-old caretaker, lived with his wife, Nagaratha Valley Ramia, and their 3 young children. The house, modest and tucked away, was a world apart from the city's glamour, its walls holding the secrets of a family unraveling under the weight of violence and desperation. On December 12, 1984, Ayacano vanished, leaving behind a mystery that would grip Singapore with horror and disbelief. A case that would come to be known as the Curry murder, a tale so gruesome it seemed torn from the pages of a macabre novel. Ayacano Marimuthu was a man of contradictions. Born in 1950 to a family of Indian descent, he had worked hard to carve out a stable life, taking a job as a caretaker for the Public Utilities Board's holiday chalets in Changi, a serene coastal area far from the city's pulse. His role was simple but demanding, maintaining the chalets, ensuring guests had a peaceful stay, and keeping the grounds in order. Since 1980, he and Nagaratha had lived in the caretaker's quarters behind the Orchard Road Presbyterian Church, a small space filled with the laughter of their children, but also the echoes of darker moments. Ayacano was known to those around him as a hard-working man, but one with a temper that flared under the influence of alcohol. When drunk, he could be cruel, his hands heavy with violence toward Nagaratha, leaving bruises that spoke louder than words. Yet, after the storm passed, he would apologize, his remorse fleeting but sincere, a cycle that trapped the family in a fragile dance of love and fear. Nagaratha, a woman in her early 30s, bore the weight of this life with quiet endurance. She was a devoted mother, her days spent tending to her children and the small home they shared. To neighbors, she and Ayacano were a hard-working couple, their struggles hidden behind closed doors. But the church community whispered of Ayacano's temper, of nights when shouts spilled from the caretaker's quarters, disturbing the sanctity of the grounds. Nagaratha's family, her mother Kamachi Krishnasamy, her three brothers Balakrishna, Ramaya, and Chandra, and their wives, including Manue, Radhakrishnana's wife, were a close-knit clan, their loyalty to one another forged in the shared hardships of immigrant life. They lived scattered across Singapore, in Jurong East and Netheravon Road, but their bond was unbreakable, a lifeline for Nagaratha in her turbulent marriage. On the morning of December 12, 1984, the air was thick with the promise of rain, the sky over Orchard Road heavy with clouds. Ayacano had been restless, his mood sour after a night of drinking. Nagaratha, weary from another argument, went about her chores, her children playing nearby. According to her later account, Ayacano announced he was heading to Hentang Highlands, a popular gambling destination in Malaysia, to try his luck at the casinos. It was not unusual for him to disappear for a few days, seeking escape in the thrill of cards or dice. He left without fanfare, his absence barely noted by the neighbors. But when days turned into a week with no word, Nagaratha's unease grew. On December 18th, she walked into the Joo Chiat police station, her face etched with worry, and filed a missing persons report. She told the officer her husband had not returned from his trip, her voice steady but her eyes betraying a flicker of something deeper. Fear, perhaps, or something more inscrutable. For 2 years, the case lay dormant, a forgotten file in the police station's records. Singapore, a city priding itself on safety and order, moved on, its streets alive with the rhythm of progress. But beneath the surface, whispers began to circulate, rumors too horrific to believe. It was not until January 9th, 1987, that the truth began to claw its way into the light. Detective G. Alagamalai, a seasoned officer with the Criminal Investigation Department, CID, received a tip that would change everything. An informant, whose identity would remain shrouded, approached him with a story so grotesque it seemed impossible. Ayacano Marimuthu had not vanished in Malaysia. He had been murdered, his body dismembered, cooked into a curry with chili powder, spices, and rice, and disposed of in roadside bins across Singapore. Alagamalai, a man hardened by years of investigating crime, felt a chill run through him. The details were too vivid, too specific to dismiss. He took the tip to his superiors, and the CID's Special Investigation Section sprang into action. The investigation was a labyrinth of dead ends and shadows. Alagamalai and his team interviewed over 30 people, piecing together fragments of Ayacano's life. They learned of his volatile nature, his drinking, and the strain it placed on his marriage. They spoke to neighbors at the Presbyterian church, who recalled hearing arguments but nothing to suggest murder. The missing persons report filed by Nagaratha was scrutinized, her story of the Hentang Highlands trip raising questions. Why had she waited 6 days to report him missing? And why, in a city as small as Singapore, had no one seen or heard from Ayakano since that December night? The informant's tale, though shocking, lacked corroboration: no body, no murder weapon, no witnesses. Yet, Alagamali's instincts told him there was truth buried in the horror. On March 23, 1987, the CID launched a pre-dawn operation, a coordinated strike across Singapore. At 2 a.m., 5 police teams fanned out, raiding a flat in Jurong East, a caretaker's quarters on Netheravon Road, and the small house behind the Orchard Road Presbyterian Church. By 9 a.m., 8 suspects were in custody: Nagaratha Valley Ramia, her mother Kamachi Krishnasamy, her brothers Balakrishna, Ramaya, and Chandra, their wives, including Manue, and 2 others whose roles remained unclear. The suspects were a family united by blood and secrets, their faces stoic as they were led away. At first, they denied everything, insisting Ayakano had gone to Hentang Highlands and never returned. But under the pressure of days-long interrogations, cracks appeared. On March 25th, one suspect, whose identity was never publicly revealed, broke, confessing details that would sear the case into Singapore's collective memory. According to the confession, the murder unfolded on the night of December 12, 1984, in the kitchen of the caretaker's quarters. Ayakano, drunk and belligerent, had been lured there by Nagaratha's brothers. What began as a confrontation spiraled into violence. An iron rod, heavy and cold, was raised and brought down with force, bludgeoning Ayakano until he lay still, his life extinguished in a pool of blood. But the horror did not end there. To cover their tracks, the family made a chilling decision. They dismembered Ayakano's body, their blades methodical in the dim light of the kitchen. His flesh was cooked in a large aluminum pot, the kind used in Indian restaurants to prepare nasi biryani, mixed with chili powder, spices, and rice. The smell, pungent and deceptive, filled the air as the curry simmered. His bones, including fragments of his skull, were stuffed into black plastic bags and scattered in roadside bins across the city. By morning, no trace of Ayakano remained, or so they thought. The confession was a bombshell, but it was not enough. The CID scoured the city, searching bins, landfills, and the caretaker's quarters, but found nothing: no body parts, no pot, no iron rod. The passage of 2 years had erased physical evidence, leaving only the informant's tip and the confession, both of which were hearsay without corroboration. The suspects, now reduced to 6, Nagaratha, her mother Kamachi, her brothers Balakrishna, Ramaya, and Chandra, and Manue, were charged with murder and abetment. The stakes were high. In Singapore, murder carried the death penalty, a noose waiting for those convicted. The case gripped the nation, its details splashed across newspapers like the Straits Times. The term curry murder emerged, a moniker that captured the public's morbid fascination with the alleged method of disposal. On June 6, 1987, the subordinate courts complex was packed, nearly 200 spectators crowding Court 26 to witness the trial. The air was thick with anticipation, the weight of the accusations hanging over the room. Nagaratha, her face pale but composed, stood alongside her family, their lawyers Subbiah Pillai and Raj Kumar ready to defend them. But the hearing lasted only 12 minutes. Deputy Public Prosecutor Ong Sin Tek rose, his voice steady as he admitted the prosecution's fatal flaw. There was insufficient evidence to proceed. Without a body, a murder weapon, or a single eyewitness, the case rested on a confession that could not be substantiated. District Judge Zainal Abidin had no choice. He granted the 6 suspects a discharge not amounting to an acquittal, meaning they could be recharged if new evidence surfaced. The courtroom buzzed with disbelief as the suspects were led away, their freedom bittersweet. For Nagaratha, Kamachi, and Manue, the ordeal seemed over. The High Court granted them bail, $5,000 in one surety, or $2,500 in two, allowing them to return to their lives. But for Balakrishna, Ramaya, and Chandra, the relief was short-lived. That same day, they were rearrested under the Criminal Law, Temporary Provisions Act, a controversial law allowing detention without trial for suspected threats to public safety. They were sent to Changi prison, where they would remain for 4 years, their fate uncertain. The CID, led by Assistant Commissioner Jagjit Singh, vowed to continue the investigation, calling the case one of the most unusual and bizarre in Singapore's history. Singh, a veteran officer, was haunted by the lack of closure. The absence of Ayakanos remains a constant reminder of the crime's audacity. The years that followed were marked by silence and speculation. The 3 brothers, detained without charge, fought for their freedom through legal challenges. In March 1991, their persistence paid off. A habeas corpus application succeeded, and on June 21, 1991, Balakrishna, Ramaya, and Chandra walked out of Changi prison, unconditionally released. The victory was hollow, their names forever linked to a crime that could neither be proven nor fully disproven. Nagaratha and her family retreated from the public eye, their lives shadowed by suspicion. The Presbyterian Church, once a place of worship, became synonymous with the Curry Murder Church, a grim landmark in Singapore's history. In 1995, the case resurfaced in an unexpected way. The Television Corporation of Singapore aired Dr. Justice, a Mandarin drama serial featuring 5 true crime stories, including the Curry murder. The episode dramatized the events, casting the suspects as villains in a tale of betrayal and brutality. The 6 former suspects, outraged, sued the Straits Times and the Television Corporation for defamation, arguing that the coverage implied their guilt. The court, however, ruled in favor of the defendants, finding that the reporting dealt only with facts and did not overstep into libel. The lawsuit's failure was another blow to the family, their attempt to clear their names thwarted by the case's enduring notoriety. For the children of Ayakano and Nagaratha, now growing up in a world that whispered their father's name, the mystery was a heavy burden. They were too young to remember him clearly, their memories fragmented by time and trauma. Nagaratha, protective and resolute, shielded them from the public's gaze, raising them in the quiet corners of Singapore. She never spoke publicly of the case, her silence a fortress against the past. Kamachi, the matriarch, grew frail, her role in the alleged crime, if any, buried in the family's collective secrecy. The brothers, hardened by their years in detention, rebuilt their lives, but the stigma clung to them like a shadow. Detective Alagamalai, now older and nearing retirement, never forgot the case. It was a specter that haunted his career, a puzzle unsolved despite his best efforts. He had interviewed countless suspects, chased leads across the city, and stood in the kitchen where Ayakano's life was said to have ended. The absence of evidence gnawed at him, the informant's story both a clue and a curse. Jagjit Singh, too, carried the weight of the case, his words to the press in 1987 echoing through the years. The remains of the body have never been found, and the deceased had not even been reported to have been murdered. The Curry murder was a wound in Singapore's psyche, a reminder that even in a city of order, darkness could thrive. The case remains unsolved, its questions unanswered. Did Nagaratha and her family orchestrate a perfect crime, their act of violence concealed by a pot of curry and a city's refuse? Or was the informant's story a fabrication, a cruel rumor that destroyed a family's reputation? The truth, like Ayakano's body, has never been found. In the quiet of Orchard Road, where the Presbyterian Church still stands, the echoes of that December night linger, a ghost story whispered in the shadows of a city that never forgets. Story 4. The Bayou country of Louisiana has a way of holding its secrets. Thick with Spanish moss and slow-moving water, the small communities that dot the marshlands between Homa and the Gulf of Mexico are tight-knit places where neighbors know each other's names, where children ride bikes on quiet streets, and where the rhythm of life moves like the sluggish current of the nearby bayou, unhurried and steady. Bourg, Louisiana is one such town, a place just 15 minutes from Homa, cradled in Terrebonne Parish. It is the kind of town where a woman like Pamela Miles Johnson could feel safe. And for 56 years she did. Pamela was, by every account of those who loved her, a woman built from something rare. She had grown up full of energy and warmth, the kind of girl who could fill a room without saying a single word, simply because her presence carried joy in it. She had been a cheerleader during her junior high and high school years, and even then, friends recalled, she was not only performing for the crowd, but genuinely lifting the spirits of everyone around her. After graduating high school, Pamela married a man named Charles Johnson, and the two of them built a life together that, in its early years at least, seemed like everything a young couple could ask for. They traveled the country, moving through cities and small towns, with Pamela treating every new face as a potential friend. Those who knew her best said she never met a stranger. Wherever she went, she left behind the impression of someone who cared, genuinely and deeply, about the people she encountered. Eventually, she and Charles settled in Bourg, Louisiana, putting down roots in a quiet house on Country Drive, in a community that would come to know Pamela as one of its most beloved residents. The Johnson family grew over the years. Pamela and Charles adopted a daughter named Christina, who would later remember her mother as a fierce protector, a woman who stood in front of the people she loved and refused to let the world hurt them. "Everyone knew Mom," Christina would later say. "She chaperoned every trip, and it was always me and her." That image, a mother walking alongside her child, the quiet, steady anchor of the family, is the image that stays with those who loved Pamela. But it was not just Christina who depended on Pamela's steadfast love. She had taken in two young nieces as well, giving them a home, a routine, and the kind of nurturing presence that children who have been through difficulty desperately need. She treated these girls as her own, making sure they were fed, clothed, taken to school, and loved without condition. Her sister, Lisa Miles, helped watch the girls when they needed to be at different places at the same time, and the two sisters formed a partnership held together by shared devotion to the children. Lisa would later recall with a smile how Pamela refused to accept help without trying to compensate for it. Even after Lisa told her repeatedly that she did not need to be paid for watching the nieces, Pamela would quietly slip money into her sister's purse. When Lisa started leaving her purse in the car to avoid this, Pamela simply smiled. "She always put others first," Lisa said. At work, Pamela carried the same spirit. She worked at a Social Security Administration office, a job that brought her into contact with people at some of the most vulnerable moments of their lives. People who were sick, aging, financially struggling, or navigating complex systems they did not fully understand. Pamela was not the kind of employee who processed claims and moved on. She was the one who sat with clients, who learned the details of their cases, who went above and beyond the requirements of her role, because she understood that the person sitting across from her was not just a file number. They were a human being who needed help. She loved to shop at stores like Ross and Marshall's, searching the racks with patience and an eye for a good deal. She loved to throw parties, and her sister Lisa said she could plan a celebration in 2 weeks and fill the house to overflowing. She was, in every sense of the phrase, the life of the party, not because she sought the spotlight, but because her laughter and energy were magnetic. And yet, for all her outward warmth, Pamela kept her private life private. She was generous with her time and her heart, but not with the difficulties she carried inside. She was the kind of person who helped others through their storms while quietly weathering her own. As the years passed, Pamela's marriage to Charles began to unravel. Beneath the surface of the quiet house on Country Drive, something had gone deeply, irreparably wrong between husband and wife. The couple had accumulated property and assets together, a life built over decades, and as the possibility of divorce became a reality, the question of how to divide what they had built together became, for Charles, a source of consuming anxiety. Louisiana follows community property law, which means that assets acquired during a marriage are generally split equally between spouses upon divorce. For a man who had watched those assets accumulate and come to see them as his own, the prospect of giving up half felt intolerable. It was in this crucible of resentment and financial fear that Charles Johnson allegedly made the darkest decision of his life, that he did not want to lose his homes, his retirement savings, his share of the life they had built. Then Charles Johnson allegedly reached out to a man named Shannon Robinson, a 43-year-old from Houma, and arranged for him to murder Pamela. The details of how this arrangement came to be, how much money changed hands, and what promises were made remain, in part of an active prosecution. But the outline is chilling in its simplicity. A man allegedly placed a price on his wife's life so that he would not have to share what they had built together. The night of Monday, November 30th, 2015, settled overboard with no particular drama. The bayou night was quiet. The streets of Country Drive were still. Inside the house at 4024 Country Drive, the two young nieces who lived with Pamela were in their home. Whatever happened in those final hours, whatever terror descended on that quiet house, the details that survived in the record are few but devastating. Sometime that night, a man arrived at the home. He was described as a tall, thin black man between the ages of 25 and 35. He entered the home, and according to the charge of aggravated kidnapping later filed against Shannon Robinson, he took the two young girls from their residence. And before he left, he shot Pamela Miles Johnson once in the head. The next morning, December 1st, 2015, began with the sound of two frightened children. At around 8:30 in the morning, the two young nieces appeared on Wade Street in Houma, about 15 minutes from their home in Bourg, and approached a woman on the street. They were alone, scared, and trying to make sense of what they had experienced. They told her that their aunt had been shot. Near where the girls were found sat a gray Buick Enclave, a vehicle registered to Pamela Johnson, abandoned on the street like a discarded piece of evidence. The Houma Police Department contacted the Terrebonne Parish Sheriff's Office. Deputies drove to 4024 Country Drive. They knocked, perhaps, or perhaps they simply walked in. The details of that moment are not recorded in what became public. But what they found inside that house on Country Drive changed the case from a missing persons inquiry to a homicide. Pamela Miles Johnson was dead. She lay inside her home, the woman who had spent her entire life giving herself to others, killed by a single gunshot wound to the head. She was 56 years old. The grief that fell over Bourg and over the people who knew Pamela was immense. She had been a constant, a person who showed up at every school trip, who slipped money into her sister's purse, who sat with Social Security clients when no one else would, who opened her home to children who needed love. And now she was gone, taken in the most violent and senseless of ways. Her daughter Christina, her sister Lisa, her nieces who had just been taken from the home in the night, all of them were left to make sense of a loss that made no sense at all. Investigators from the Terrebonne Parish Sheriff's Office worked the scene methodically. They interviewed Pamela's family members, friends, co-workers, neighbors, and employers. Every single one of them spoke highly of her. There was no trail of enemies, no record of disputes, no shadow of the kind of life that sometimes explains why violence finds a person. Pamela was, by every account, someone who should have been safe. The description of a tall, thin man seen near the area was released to the public. Detectives knocked on doors, followed leads, and built a case file that grew over months and then years without breaking open. The case went cold, not for lack of effort, but for lack of the final, crucial pieces of evidence needed to take a case to a jury. For 6 years, the case sat in that painful, suspended state that cold cases occupy. Known to those who had loved Pamela, felt in the emptiness she left behind, but without resolution. Christina still thought about her mother. Lisa still remembered the money slipped quietly into her purse. The nieces, now older, carried the trauma of that night in November 2015. The night they were taken from their home by a stranger while their aunt was shot. Then, in May 2022, a development emerged from the investigative work that had quietly continued. Detectives arrested 2 men, Shannon Robinson, then 40 years old, and George Earl Robinson Jr., then 33, both of Houma. They were charged with first-degree murder and aggravated kidnapping in connection with the killing of Pamela Johnson. The arrest of the two men felt, for a moment, like the beginning of justice. But the legal system does not always move in the direction those who grieve most desperately need it to move. The case against the two men was presented to a grand jury, and the grand jury, the panel of citizens who must decide whether there is enough evidence to proceed to a formal trial, declined to indict. The charges did not proceed. Robinson and Robinson Jr. walked free. For Pamela's family, it was a second blow delivered in the same wound. The case against the men who were believed to have taken her life had collapsed before it ever reached a courtroom. The investigation was not closed, but it was again without answers. What followed was another chapter of patient, exhausting detective work. The Terrebonne Parish Sheriff's Office detectives did not stop. They continued to investigate, continued to follow every thread, continued to look for the piece of evidence that would change the equation. Investigators later revealed that new evidence eventually surfaced. Evidence that not only re-established the case against Shannon Robinson, but also, crucially, drew a direct line from the triggerman to the man investigators believed had ordered the killing. That man, they now believed, was Charles Johnson, Pamela's own husband, the man she had married after high school, the man with whom she had traveled the country, the man with whom she had built a home and adopted a daughter and lived for decades, had allegedly, according to prosecutors, arranged to have her killed rather than divide their shared life during a divorce. The new evidence reportedly confirmed something that investigators had suspected but needed to prove, that the murder of Pamela Johnson was not a random act of violence, not a burglary gone wrong, not a tragedy born of chaos. It was, according to prosecutors, a conspiracy to kill for financial gain, a deliberate, planned act of murder. On September 15, 2025, nearly 10 years after Pamela's body was found on Country Drive, detectives arrived at a residence on Greenwich Street in Houma. They arrested Charles Johnson, now 70 years old, and charged him with first-degree murder and solicitation for murder. Within hours, they had located Shannon Robinson, now 43, and arrested him as well, charging him with first-degree murder, solicitation for murder, and aggravated kidnapping. Both men were booked into the Terrebonne Parish Criminal Justice Complex and held without bond. Sheriff Tim Soynett stood before reporters and spoke with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had waited a long time to say what he was about to say. "This arrest has been 10 years in the making," he said, "and we are extremely confident that the people responsible are finally in custody. Sometimes cases such as these take longer to solve than we would like, but I am proud of the dedication of our investigators to bring justice to the victims and families in our community." District Attorney Joseph Waits stood alongside the sheriff and addressed the question that had haunted the case from the beginning. Why? Why would a man arrange the murder of the woman he had once promised to love? The answer, Waits said, was both simple and devastating. To kill someone over this is very sad, very tragic. It was, in the end, about houses and retirement accounts, about the fear of losing half of what Charles Johnson had come to believe was entirely his. Soynett added that it was likely the fear of losing his homes, his retirement, everything he had accumulated, that had led Charles Johnson to allegedly hire Shannon Robinson to end his wife's life. The case remained active as of the arrests, with investigators leaving open the possibility that additional charges or arrests could follow. George Earl Robinson Jr., who had been arrested in 2022 but not recharged, remained under scrutiny. "We're still investigating," Soynett said. "We're going to look at everything." For the family of Pamela Miles Johnson, the arrests brought something complicated. Not the clean resolution of a solved crime, but the beginning of a legal reckoning that they had waited a decade to see. The question of whether a jury will ultimately confirm what prosecutors allege remains, as of this writing, unanswered. The trial is yet to come. But what is not in question, what no courtroom verdict can change or diminish, is who Pamela Miles Johnson was. She was the woman who slipped money into her sister's purse and smiled when she got caught. She was the mother who chaperoned every school trip. She was the employee who sat with struggling clients long after her shift had technically ended. She was the aunt who took in two young girls and made a home for them, who protected them the way she protected everyone she loved. The night of November 30th, 2015, the bayou darkness of Borg swallowed the story of what happened on Country Drive. For nearly a decade, that darkness held. But the Terrebonne Parish detectives, the investigators who had carried the case file through years of silence and dead ends, and a grand jury that said no, refused to let it stay buried. She showed me how to help others without getting anything in return. Her sister Lisa had said, years before the arrests, back when the case was still cold and justice still felt impossibly far away. She showed me the meaning of being a blessing to others. In the end, a blessing to others was exactly what Pamela Miles Johnson was. And in the end, after 10 long years, the machinery of justice finally turned in her direction. Slow, imperfect, and long overdue, but turning nonetheless. Story 5. The Rocky Mountains cast long shadows over Woodland Park, Colorado, a quiet, tucked-away town nestled at roughly 8,500 feet above sea level, where the air is thin and crisp, and neighbors still nod to each other on the sidewalk. It was the kind of place where people moved to build something simple and honest, away from the noise of the cities below. Kelsey Barrett had chosen this place deliberately. She was building a life here, piece by piece, day by day, with her hands and her will, and a quiet determination that people who knew her never forgot. Kelsey was 29 years old, a slender woman with warm eyes and a gentle smile, genuinely kind, not the performed kind that some people wear as a mask. She had grown up in Washington State, on a family farm where the sky stretched wide and the land was open, and somewhere in that open sky, a dream had taken root. From a very young age, Kelsey wanted to fly. Her mother, Cheryl, remembered her daughter watching crop dusters sweep low over the fields, their engines humming in the morning air, and decided that was exactly what she wanted to do with her life. It was not a passing fancy. Kelsey pursued aviation with a focused, methodical discipline that defined everything she did. She eventually found her way to DOS Aviation in Pueblo, Colorado, where she became a certified flight instructor. She was teaching United States Air Force cadets how to fly, young men and women who would go on to serve their country, and she was giving them their wings. Every morning, Kelsey drove 60 miles from her apartment in Woodland Park to Pueblo. Every evening, she drove 60 miles back. It was a long commute, but she did it without complaint, because this life she was constructing, this careful, purposeful existence, had a new center of gravity. Her daughter, Kaylee. Kaylee had been born in 2017, and in the way that only a child can, she had rearranged everything. Kelsey threw herself into motherhood with the same intensity she brought to everything else. Her friends described her as a single mother who was doing it all, working full-time, caring for her infant daughter, managing her household, and still showing up for the people around her with warmth and patience. She was remarkable without being loud about it. She was the kind of person who, as her childhood friend Ashley Cogburn once said, had it all going on. She was really smart. She was on top of her game in life. But behind the composed exterior, there were cracks forming. Cracks that few people were allowed to see. Kaylee's father was a man named Patrick Frazee. Patrick Frazee was 33 years old, a Colorado native who had grown up in the rugged, rural community of Florissant, a place even smaller and more remote than Woodland Park, the kind of place where a man could live his whole life and never quite be known by anyone outside his small circle. Frazee was a rancher. He lived on a 35-acre property, a working homestead where he trained cattle dogs, shod horses, and tended to his animals with the rough, competent hands of someone raised doing physical labor. To the people around him, he was charming and capable, a country boy, steady and dependable, the type of man who would fix your fence without being asked. His neighbors liked him, his friends trusted him, and Kelsey Barrett, at some point, had fallen for him too. Their relationship had begun as a long-distance romance, the two connected by their shared love of the rural Colorado life and eventually by the child they brought into the world. But the relationship had become something shadowed and difficult. Kelsey believed Frazee had been borderline emotionally abusive, that there was a controlling energy beneath the surface of the relationship that Kelsey had endured quietly, as people often do when they are tangled in something complicated and painful. They were engaged but did not live together. They shared a daughter, but not a household. Their life together existed in a kind of unresolved tension, and by the autumn of 2018, Kelsey and Patrick were in the painful process of separating. What Kelsey did not know, what she could not have known, was that Patrick Frazee had already been planning something unthinkable for months. There was another woman. Her name was Crystal Jean Lee Kenny. She was 32 years old, a nurse and a passionate horsewoman who had grown up in southern Idaho, in a world of open plains and rodeo culture. In 2008, she had been crowned Queen of the Magic Valley Rodeo, a title that spoke to her deep roots in that community. She was a woman of the land, someone who understood horses and wide open spaces, and in Patrick Frazee, she had found what she thought was a kindred spirit. They had been in a romantic relationship together, secret, hidden, conducted in the shadows of Frazee's life in Colorado while Kelsey raised their daughter just 20 miles away. Crystal was not a monster. She was, as this story will show, a woman who found herself drawn step by terrifying step into something she could neither fully control nor escape. According to Crystal's own account, which she would later deliver in painstaking, tearful detail to investigators and ultimately to a courtroom full of strangers, Patrick Frazee had come to her not once, not twice, but 3 separate times with an extraordinary request. He wanted her to kill Kelsey Barrett. The first plan was simple and cold. Frazee allegedly suggested that Crystal obtain a caramel macchiato from Starbucks, poison it, and deliver it to Kelsey. He knew Kelsey's routines, her preferences, the small details of her daily life that made such a scheme horrifyingly possible. The second plan involved physical violence. The third, yet another variation of the same dark intention. Each time, Crystal Lee refused. She could not do it. Whether from conscience or fear, or some deeply buried sense of right and wrong, she turned him down every time. She did not, however, report what he had asked her to do. She stayed silent, and in that silence, she became entwined in a conspiracy that would consume both of their lives. Thanksgiving Day arrived on November 22nd, 2018. It was a Thursday, the kind of clear, cold autumn day that Colorado does so beautifully. Brilliant blue sky, air sharp with the first real bite of winter. Kelsey Barrett got her little daughter Kaylee dressed that morning, bundled her up against the chill, and drove to the local Safeway supermarket in Woodland Park. The surveillance camera above the store entrance captured them both, Kelsey pushing a cart, Kaylee riding alongside her. A young mother doing the ordinary, beautiful work of caring for her child on a holiday morning. It is the last recorded image of Kelsey Barrett alive. At some point that afternoon, a person matching Patrick Frazee's description was captured by a neighbor's surveillance camera entering the front door of Kelsey's apartment. Investigators would later determine that this was the moment the unimaginable happened. According to the account Frazee himself later gave and the evidence gathered at the scene, he allegedly blindfolded Kelsey, telling her to smell a scented candle, and then attacked her with a baseball bat, beating her to death in her own home. Kelsey had reportedly begged him to stop. He did not stop. The apartment fell silent. In the hours after the killing, Frazee allegedly called Crystal Lee Kenny in Idaho and told her that she had a mess to clean up. It was a chilling phrase, stripped of any emotion, the language of someone who had already made the transition from human being to something colder. He moved Kelsey's body to a location he called Nash Ranch, wrapped in a black tote. Then he drove away, taking Kelsey's cell phone with him. 2 days later, on November 24th, Crystal Lee Kenny made the drive from Idaho to Woodland Park, a journey of over 800 miles, and entered Kelsey's apartment. What she found there, she would later describe in terms that made even hardened investigators pause. She scrubbed the apartment with bleach and chemical cleaning agents. She worked methodically, removing every visible trace of what had happened. But in a moment that prosecutors later called a small, desperate act of conscience, Crystal deliberately left traces of blood in 2 places. near the fireplace and on a baby gate, hoping, she said, that investigators would someday find them. She later told agents, "I was hoping investigators would find it." It was a quiet act of rebellion against what she had become part of, a tiny breadcrumb dropped in a forest of deception. After she finished cleaning, she and Frazee retrieved Kelsey's body from Nash Ranch. They drove it back to Frazee's property in Florissant. There, in the cold dark of the Colorado night, they placed the black tote, with Kelsey's remains inside, along with the baseball bat and other evidence, into a 100-gallon trough. They doused it all with motor oil and 5 gallons of gasoline, added wood to feed the fire, and burned everything. Crystal Lee would later testify that at some point during the burning, after the tote had melted away, she believed she may have seen what remained of a human body in the fire. The image never left her, but they did not burn Kelsey's cell phone. This was a mistake, and ultimately, it was the thread that began to unravel everything. In the days after Thanksgiving, life in Woodland Park continued as though nothing had happened. Patrick Frazee told people he and Kelsey had been talking by phone, texting about their breakup, carrying on the kind of quiet, painful communication that separated couples do. Cell phone records seemed to confirm this. Messages were being sent from Kelsey's number to Frazee and to her employer, suggesting she was alive and mobile. But Crystal Lee Kenny was sending those messages. She had Kelsey's phone. Following Frazee's instructions, she drove the phone back toward Idaho, sending texts along the way to create the impression that Kelsey was traveling, that she had, perhaps, simply chosen to disappear. For 10 days, Kelsey Barrett's silence was explained away. But her mother, Cheryl, knew her daughter. She knew that Kelsey did not simply vanish without a word, without a call, without a sign. A mother's instinct is not easily dismissed. On December 2nd, Cheryl reported her daughter missing to authorities. Investigators began the grim and careful work of reconstructing the last days of Kelsey Barrett's life. They spoke to Patrick Frazee, who presented himself as a concerned fiancé, explaining that he had last seen Kelsey when she dropped Kaylee off with him on Thanksgiving afternoon, and that the two of them had continued to communicate afterward. It was a plausible story, delivered by a man who appeared calm. But investigators are trained to look beneath the surface of calm. The first break came through the cell phone. Investigators traced Kelsey's phone, the device allegedly still transmitting and sending messages, to a location near Gooding, Idaho, more than 800 miles northwest of Woodland Park. This was puzzling. Why would Kelsey drive to Idaho without telling anyone? Why was she not returning calls from her mother? And then came something more concrete. When investigators gained access to Kelsey's apartment, they found blood. Not much, but enough. It was smeared near the fireplace and on a baby gate. The apartment smelled faintly of cleaning chemicals. Something had happened here, and someone had tried very hard to make it look like nothing had. Law enforcement agencies widened their net. The FBI joined the investigation and tracked down Crystal Lee Kenny, eventually locating her at a rodeo in Las Vegas. Kenny initially denied everything. She lied to agents, held the story together with whatever she had left, and then, faced with the weight of the evidence beginning to pile against her, she got a lawyer. And on December 20th, 2018, Crystal Lee Kenny made the decision that would define the rest of this story. She started talking. For 4.5 hours, Crystal Lee sat with investigators and did not stop. She told them everything. The 3 times Frazee had asked her to kill Kelsey, the poisoned Starbucks drink, the other plans, her refusals, the phone call on Thanksgiving telling her to clean up the apartment, the drive to Idaho, the burning of the body, the text messages sent from a dead woman's phone. She broke down at points. She wept. When the interview was done, she took investigators personally to Kelsey's apartment and pointed to the fireplace, to the baby gate, to the exact spots where she had deliberately left the blood. "Right there," she said, pointing with a steady hand at the fireplace, a gesture that was both devastating and, in its own strange way, a long overdue act of truth-telling. The next day, December 21st, 2018, law enforcement descended on Patrick Frazee's ranch in Florissant. He He was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. He pleaded not guilty, maintaining his innocence with the same composure he had shown since the beginning. Baby Kaylee, at the center of everything and yet untouched by the comprehension of it all, was taken into emergency protective custody by Teller County Social Services. Kelsey's parents, Cheryl and Darrell Barrett, eventually won temporary custody of the little girl, keeping her in the arms of the family her mother had loved and built her life around. The trial of Patrick Frazee began on November 1st, 2019, inside an old courthouse in Cripple Creek, Colorado, a building that had stood for 115 years, witness to more than a century of human reckoning. Frazee sat at the defense table throughout the proceedings with an expression that witnesses described as flat and unreadable. His attorneys argued that Crystal Lee Kenny was an unreliable narrator, a woman with a motive to lie, a woman who had lied before, a woman whose testimony was the cornerstone of an entire case built on a foundation of words rather than physical evidence. And that much, at least, was true. Kelsey Barrett's body had never been found. There was no corpse, no forensic confirmation of the cause of death, no murder weapon recovered intact. What the prosecution had, in the starkest terms, was Crystal Lee's testimony and the pattern of evidence that surrounded it. Crystal Lee took the stand and faced the courtroom. She had pleaded guilty earlier to tampering with evidence, specifically for transporting Barrett's cell phone to Idaho, and had agreed, in exchange for a plea deal capping her sentence at 3 years, to testify fully and truthfully. What she delivered was not the performance of a calculated liar. It was the account of a woman who had been drawn into something terrible by a relationship she had not fully understood, who had failed to act when she should have acted, and who had arrived, finally and at great cost, at the truth. She told the jury that Frazee had described the murder to her in detail. He told her he had beaten Kelsey with a baseball bat. He told her he just swung away, and that it was really hard. And then, in the sentence that settled like a stone over the entire courtroom, she said, "He told me that she begged him to please stop." She said his motive was simple and brutal. He wanted her not to be a problem anymore. He wanted her dead. 11 days of testimony. Families, investigators, forensic analysts, witnesses who had known both Frazee and Barrett. After everything was heard, the jury of 6 men and 6 women took less than 4 hours to reach their verdict. On November 18, 2019, almost exactly 1 year after Kelsey Barrett had walked into that Safeway with her baby daughter and disappeared from the world, the foreman stood and read guilty. Guilty of first-degree murder. Guilty of solicitation to commit murder, 3 counts. Guilty of tampering with a deceased human body. Guilty on all charges. Judge Paul Markson sentenced Patrick Frazee to life in prison without the possibility of parole for the murder. For the additional charges, the solicitation counts, the tampering, he added 156 years. Patrick Frazee would grow old and die inside a prison cell. He would never set foot on his ranch again. He would never see his daughter grow up outside the walls of a visitation room, if she ever chose to see him at all. Crystal Lee Kenny received her 3-year sentence for evidence tampering, which was subsequently vacated on appeal in 2021. Her cooperation had been indispensable to the conviction, and the courts acknowledged the complexity of her position. A woman who had been manipulated, who had failed at critical moments, and who had ultimately done the one thing she could still do, which was tell the truth. Kelsey Barrett's remains were never recovered. The fire on that cold Colorado night had consumed them completely. There is no grave, no headstone, no physical place where those who loved her can stand and speak to her. There is only the memory of the woman she was, the flight instructor who drove 120 miles every day without complaint, the mother who loved her baby daughter with everything she had, the young woman from Washington State who had gone to the mountains to build something honest and good. Her daughter, Kaylee, grew up in the care of Kelsey's parents, raised in the love of grandparents who had lost a child but refused to lose a grandchild to the wreckage of what had happened. She is the living continuation of Kelsey Barrett's story, a little girl growing up in the world her mother never got to fully share with her. On the 1-year anniversary of her daughter's death, Cheryl Barrett stood before reporters and said the simplest, most devastating thing. She's a good person. I couldn't ask for a better daughter. It is a sentence built entirely of love. The kind of love that does not know how to speak in past tense. The kind that refuses to let go even when there is nothing left to hold. The sky over Colorado does not remember Kelsey Barrett the way a person remembers a face or a voice. But somewhere up in that wide, cold blue, among the air currents and the altitude and the silence between clouds, it is possible to imagine her, free of everything that happened below, finally at peace. Story 6. There is a particular kind of freedom that belongs only to the open road, and Dorothy Alice Tate had claimed it fully for herself in the autumn of 1983. She was 40 years old, a waitress from the small mountain town of Estes Park, Colorado, a woman who had built a quiet, unhurried life at the foot of the Rockies, pouring coffee, writing down orders, carrying plates to tables, and spending whatever free hours she had outdoors. She was unpretentious, adventurous in a modest, wholesome way, and deeply devoted to her 2 Queensland Blue Heeler dogs, who went everywhere she did, and whom she treated less like pets and more like companions in the oldest, truest sense of the word. Everyone who knew Dorothy called her Toby. It was the kind of nickname that suited a woman who preferred jeans to dresses and mountain air to city noise, breezy, warm, and entirely her own. In November of 1983, Toby loaded her dogs into her cream-colored van, pointed it west, and drove out of Colorado toward the California coast, toward the Pacific Ocean, toward the spectacle of Highway 1 and the famous stretch of shoreline, where the road clings to the cliffs above the sea, and the view on a clear morning is enough to make a person forget everything that ever troubled them. She carried her dogs, her camera, a brand new Nikon she was proud of, and enough cash and supplies for a comfortable road trip alone. She did not know that 2 men were watching her. Estes Park sits at the edge of Rocky Mountain National Park, at an elevation of nearly 8,000 feet, where the winters come early and the summers are a gift that the locals never quite take for granted. It was the kind of town where a waitress like Toby Tate was known by the regulars who came in for breakfast, known by the neighbors who saw her dogs trotting alongside her on her morning walks, known in the comfortable, unremarkable way that people are known in small mountain communities where everyone has a history and most people have a story. She was not a woman of great wealth or public prominence. She was simply a person who loved the outdoors, loved her animals, and had decided in the autumn of her 40th year to take a solo trip to California. The van she drove was her home away from home, a self-contained little world that she had organized for the journey, fitted with everything she needed to camp along the way. She was the kind of traveler who preferred campgrounds to motels, who liked to wake up outside, who took her dogs to the beach because watching them run through the waves made the trip feel complete. By November 14th, 1983, she had made her way to San Simeon, a small community on the central coast of California, 3 miles below Hearst Castle, the enormous and legendary hilltop estate built by newspaper magnate William Randolph Hearst. The San Simeon Creek campground sits just off Highway 1 at the point where the Santa Lucia Mountains meet the sea, and on the right night, cool, clear, with the sound of the Pacific carrying up through the pines. There are few more beautiful places to sleep in America. Toby set up camp there, walked her dogs, and settled in for the night. That night was the last night she would spend alive. The morning of November 15th, 1983, began as most mornings begin at a coastal campground, with the sound of waves and birds and the particular crystalline quality of Pacific light that never quite translates in photographs. Toby Tate woke up and did what she always did. She took her dogs out. She walked them down to the beach, just south of where her van was parked, and let them run. Investigators would later find evidence of this final, peaceful routine in the most quietly devastating way imaginable. When detectives examined her body that morning, they found sand between her toes. She had been barefoot on the beach or had worn open shoes, and the sand had worked its way between her toes as she walked along the shoreline with her 2 blue heelers running ahead of her in the foam. It was such a small, human detail, sand between the toes, and yet it placed her in that specific morning, in that specific light, at the edge of the Pacific Ocean, alive and unhurried, a woman on a trip she had looked forward to and fully deserved. Investigators believed that two men had been watching her. They had noticed the van. They had either followed her or observed her from a distance, studying her routine, waiting for the moment when she returned from her walk and made herself vulnerable. What they saw was a lone woman with a nice vehicle, a camera, cash, and no one beside her who might intervene. They waited, and when Toby Tate returned from the beach, still warm with the morning and the sea air and the joy of the run, they were ready. Sometime that morning, on a quiet turnout along Highway 1 approximately 3 miles north of Hearst Castle, Toby Tate was shot in the side of the head. Detective Clint Cole, the cold case investigator who would eventually solve this murder more than 40 years later, reconstructed what had happened with precision. He believes she was shot through the driver's side window while she was seated, ambushed from outside the van by someone who did not want a confrontation, did not want a struggle, simply wanted what she had and wanted her to be silent. The shot killed her. She was then dragged from the driver's seat to the back of the van, where she lay still and undisturbed in a vehicle parked at a roadside pull-out while the rest of Highway 1 went about its morning. From the van, the two men took everything of obvious value. They took approximately $400 in cash. They took her purse and her credit cards. They took her new Nikon camera, the one she had brought to photograph the coastline, the one she had probably been looking forward to using on the stretch of Highway 1 north of San Simeon, which is among the most photographed coastal roads in the world. And then they left. They left the van on the turnout, with Toby Tate's body in the back, and drove away from the coast with everything they had stolen and a trail of evidence they did not know they had left behind. One of them was bleeding. He had left a trail of blood leading away from the vehicle. Not Toby's blood, but his own, either from a wound sustained during the crime or in its immediate aftermath. In the clutter and rush of their departure, neither man noticed the Coca-Cola can that had been left at the scene. These two small things, the blood and the can, would one day be the instruments of justice. But that day was very far away. It was passing motorists who noticed first. A cream-colored van, parked at a highway turnout, with something wrong about the way the light was catching the door. Blood was dripping from the van's door onto the asphalt. People slowed, then stopped, then called for help. San Luis Obispo County Sheriff's deputies arrived and looked inside the van. What they found in the back was 40-year-old Dorothy Tate, silent and still, a woman who had woken that morning for a walk on the beach and never made it back to her life. Her two blue heeler dogs were also at the scene, presumably still in the van or nearby, faithful companions to the very end, unable to explain what they had witnessed. Investigators moved through the scene with the careful attention that violent crime demands. They photographed everything, cataloged the missing items, collected blood samples from the trail leading away from the vehicle. They noted the absence of any sign of sexual assault. Toby was found fully clothed, which told them almost immediately that robbery was the motive. This had not been a crime of rage or obsession. It had been cold commerce. Two men who saw something they wanted, took it, and shot the owner to prevent interference. The Coca-Cola can was collected and logged into evidence. The trail of blood was collected. Every surface in the van was examined. The investigation of the murder of Dorothy Toby Tate had begun, and everyone who worked those early hours believed they were building toward an answer that would come quickly, as such answers often do when the evidence is fresh and the trail is still warm. They were wrong. The answer would take 42 years. The investigation moved through its initial phases with diligence, and then slowly, the way all cold cases eventually do, it began to stall. In the absence of a known motive beyond robbery, and in the absence of any identified suspect, the evidence that existed, the blood, the can, the missing camera, became the entire foundation of the case. Detectives began tracing the camera, following whatever commercial thread they could find. In 1987, a lead emerged. The Nikon camera had surfaced in a pawn shop in Bakersfield, California, roughly 90 miles east of the campground where Toby had stayed the night before she died. Detectives from San Luis Obispo County traveled to Bakersfield to follow the lead. It was a promising thread, the kind that sometimes unravels an entire case in an afternoon. But pawn shops are transactional places. Items change hands quickly, records are incomplete, and buyers and sellers pass through without leaving much behind. By the time investigators traced the camera, it had already changed hands multiple times. Every transaction led to a dead end. The person who had originally brought Toby's stolen Nikon into that shop was long gone, untraceable, leaving behind nothing but the ghost of a lead. Over the following years, every available forensic technique of the era was applied. Blood samples were tested. The Coca-Cola can was analyzed for fingerprints. A cash reward was offered to the public, announced in the hope that someone, a neighbor, a friend, a person who had heard something they had been afraid to repeat, might come forward with the piece of information that broke everything open. Nothing came. The family of Dorothy Tate was left without answers. Her dogs, her van, her Nikon camera, her $400, all the small inventory of a modest life cut short, were cataloged in a file that grew thicker with effort and thinner in hope. The case was officially declared cold. Fingerprint identification was well established by 1983, but the science of DNA analysis as a forensic tool was still years away from general use. When investigators finally had access to genetic testing technologies in subsequent decades, they went back to the blood recovered from the crime scene and successfully extracted a male DNA profile from the evidence. This was a breakthrough of sorts. It confirmed that the blood trail left at the scene belonged to a man who had been present at the van on the morning Toby died, a man whose genetic identity was now encoded in a laboratory sample in San Luis Obispo County. But confirmation without identification is its own kind of frustration. The DNA profile was run against CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, the national database maintained by the FBI that holds genetic profiles from convicted offenders and crime scenes across the United States. The profile matched nothing. The man whose blood had been left at the scene of Toby Tate's murder had never been convicted of a crime serious enough to require DNA collection, or had never been caught for anything at all. His identity remained a wall that technology, as it stood, could not yet scale. The case was closed, reopened, closed again. Years passed, then a decade, then two, then three. The woman who had walked barefoot on a California beach with her dogs on a November morning in 1983 remained unavenged, unnamed injustice, remembered only by those who had loved her in life. Clint Cole was not a detective who accepted the word unsolvable. His record within the San Luis Obispo County Sheriff's Office had already demonstrated a particular gift for patience and lateral thinking. He was one of the investigators who had worked on the case of Kristen Smart, the college student who disappeared in 1996, and whose case was eventually solved in 2021 after a 25-year investigation, and on the case of Nancy Woodrum, another cold case that had long defied resolution. He understood, better than most, that the passage of time did not diminish the obligation of justice. It simply changed the tools available to pursue it. When Cole turned his attention to the Tate case, he brought with him both the accumulated case files of the original investigation and an awareness of what modern forensic science had become capable of doing with evidence that older methods could not penetrate. By 2023, 2 full decades had passed since the field of forensic genetic genealogy had been born, a discipline that used the same kind of consumer DNA testing that millions of people used to trace their ancestry, and then applied it, in reverse, to crime scene DNA, building family trees from biological evidence until the branches of that tree pointed toward a specific living or formerly living person. In 2023, Cole and the San Luis Obispo County Sheriff's Office partnered with Othram, a forensic genetics laboratory headquartered in the Woodlands, Texas, that specialized in extracting comprehensive DNA profiles from degraded or challenging evidence. The blood sample taken from the crime scene, preserved for 40 years in evidence storage, was submitted to Othram scientists, who applied a process called forensic-grade genome sequencing to the original DNA extract, building a comprehensive genetic profile that went far beyond what standard forensic testing could achieve. This profile was then used to conduct a forensic genetic genealogy search, the painstaking process of comparing the crime scene DNA against the vast databases of consumer genetic testing services, identifying possible relatives, building out family trees from distant cousins and half-relations, and then working backward and forward through those trees until a specific individual emerged, who was both genetically consistent with the evidence and plausibly connected to the crime in time and geography. Cole also worked alongside C.C. Moore, one of the most celebrated and meticulous genetic genealogists in the United States, whose work had already helped law enforcement identify perpetrators in dozens of cold cases across the country. Together, they combed through the genealogical threads that the Othram profile had opened up, following each branch until they arrived at a name. The name the genetic genealogy analysis produced was Stephen Richard Hardy, a man who, at the time of Toby Tate's murder in November 1983, had been a resident of Texas. The identification was not based on genealogy alone. Once Hardy was identified as a likely contributor to the crime scene DNA, investigators sought and obtained a DNA sample from one of his close living relatives, and the comparison confirmed what the genealogical analysis had strongly suggested. Stephen Richard Hardy's genetic profile matched the blood left at the scene of Dorothy Tate's murder beyond any reasonable scientific doubt. Hardy was not alone, and investigators knew that from the very beginning of the case. The original crime scene evidence had included, beyond the blood, a second piece of evidence that had been patiently waiting in storage for more than 4 decades: the Coca-Cola can. In the years since 1983, fingerprint analysis technology had advanced considerably. Cold case investigators returned to the can and the other original evidence, running the fingerprints through modern databases and comparison systems that had not existed in their current form in the early 1980s. The prints came back with a match: a man named Charlie Sneed, also a Texas resident at the time of Toby's murder. 2 men, one who had bled at the scene, and one who had left his fingerprints on a soft drink can. Both from Texas. Both, in the calculus of cold circumstance, present at the van on the morning that Toby Tate walked back from the beach and was shot through the driver's window while the Pacific Ocean rolled blue and indifferent behind her. The picture that emerged from the evidence, painstakingly assembled over 4 decades, told a story of opportunistic violence with devastating clarity. Toby Tate had not been targeted because of who she was. She had been targeted because of what she appeared to be: a lone woman far from home, traveling without a companion who might raise an alarm, in a van that suggested the presence of cameras, cash, and portable valuables. Detective Cole told journalists that he believed the 2 men had been watching her before the attack, possibly from the beach, possibly from the road, studying her movements, identifying the van as hers, and waiting for the window of opportunity that a solitary traveler inevitably presents. When Toby returned from her morning run on the beach, her guard down, her heart likely still full of the pleasure of the sea and the morning air and the simple happiness of her dogs running free, they were ready. She had not provoked them, had not known they existed, had done nothing in all her 40 years to invite this end. She had simply had the misfortune of being in the wrong place in a moment when 2 dangerous men decided that her life was worth less than the contents of her van. The Nikon camera they stole, the one she had probably saved for and carried across state lines on a trip she had planned with care, ended up in a pawn shop in Bakersfield. Her credit cards and cash disappeared without trace. Everything she had carried on that trip, every small material expression of her quiet life, was fenced or spent within days of her death. Both Stephen Richard Hardy and Charlie Sneed were dead by the time their names were finally connected to her murder. Hardy's family, reachable through the genealogical threads that forensic science had spun from his blood, provided the confirmation that closed the final gap in the evidence. Sneed's fingerprints had been in the system, his identity recoverable through the modern analysis of a can he had casually discarded at a crime scene in 1983, apparently unconcerned that it could ever be used against him. He was not wrong in 1983. In 2023, he was proven completely wrong. On January 20th, 2026, 42 years, 2 months, and 5 days after Dorothy Toby Tate was found in the back of her cream-colored van on a California highway, the San Luis Obispo County Sheriff's Office held a press conference and announced that the case had been officially solved. Sheriff Ian Parkinson stood before reporters and said plainly, "This case demonstrates the power of modern forensic science and the commitment of Detective Cole, who never stopped working to bring justice to victims and their families." The case was closed as exceptionally cleared, the designation applied in law enforcement when a case is solved but prosecution is impossible because the identified suspects are deceased. It is the only resolution available when time and biology have overtaken the legal process, and it is simultaneously a triumph and a limitation. The truth is known at last, but there will be no trial, no verdict, no sentence read aloud in a courtroom to the family of the victim. The names of Stephen Richard Hardy and Charlie Sneed were entered into the public record as the men responsible for the murder of Dorothy Alice Toby Tate. Both Texas residents, both now dead, both identified through the evidence they believed they had left behind without consequence. A drop of blood and an empty can of Coca-Cola. There are lives that vanish too quickly and too violently, and the world does not always hurry to account for them. Toby Tate was a waitress from a mountain town in Colorado. She was not famous. She had no public profile, no powerful advocates, no media platform that kept her name circulating through the years. She had her dogs and her van and her camera and the freedom of an open road she had earned one shift at a time. She had a morning on a California beach that was, by every measure, exactly the kind of morning she had driven all the way from Estes Park to find. The sand between her toes, that small, final, irreducibly human detail, speaks to who she was more than any formal record. She had gone to the beach with her dogs at first light, barefoot or in open shoes, and she had walked in the water and watched the Pacific foam across the sand and breathed the cold November air, and she had been happy. She had been exactly where she wanted to be, doing exactly what she loved, and then she had come back to her van, and the world had ended for her. The evidence that identified her killers was preserved with the quiet diligence that crime scene work demands, cataloged and stored through the administrations of multiple sheriffs, multiple cold case units, multiple generations of investigators, until the science arrived that could make it speak. The blood that one of her killers left behind became, for decades later, the instrument of his identification. The can that the other man left became his name in a database, and then his name in a press release, and then his name in the news. Detective Clint Cole, who gave years to this case alongside his other cold case investigations, refused to accept the comfort of unsolvable. He found Othram, and Othram found the DNA, and the DNA found Hardy, and the fingerprints found Sneed, and the truth found its way, at enormous cost in time and patience, to the surface. 42 years is a long time to wait for justice. It is a long time for anyone who knew Toby, who ate at the counter of the diner where she worked, who watched her walk her blue heelers through the streets of Estes Park, to carry the weight of an unanswered question. The question has been answered now. The men who killed her have names, and those names are on record, attached to the crime, permanently and irrevocably, in the official files of the San Luis Obispo County Sheriff's Office. That is what justice looks like sometimes when it is very late in coming. Not a courtroom, not a sentence, not the face of an accused man hearing a verdict read aloud. Just a name, just a record, just the world finally knowing, in the language of science and law and patient human effort, what happened on a cold November morning at the edge of Highway 1, to a woman who went for a walk on the beach with her dogs and did not deserve what came next. Story 7. The January sun hung low over Collingwood, a gritty inner-city suburb of Melbourne, Australia, casting long shadows across the narrow streets lined with modest Victorian terraces. It was 1977, a time when doors were often left unlocked and neighbors knew each other by name. On Easy Street, a quiet cul-de-sac tucked away from the bustle of the city, life moved at a gentle pace. Children played in the yards, and the hum of daily routines filled the air. But on January 13th, that peace was shattered in a way that would haunt the community for decades. Inside a small rental house at number 147, two young women, Suzanne Armstrong and Susan Bartlett, lay dead, their lives extinguished in a frenzy of violence that defied comprehension. Suzanne Armstrong, 28, was a vibrant woman with a warm smile and a fierce love for her 16-month-old son, Gregory. She had grown up in Benalla, a rural town in Victoria, where she and Susan Bartlett had been high school friends, inseparable in their youth. Suzanne's life had taken her to the Greek island of Naxos, where she gave birth to Gregory, the child of a Greek man who remained on the island. Returning to Melbourne, she settled into the Easy Street house, creating a home filled with laughter and the soft coos of her toddler. Susan, 27, was a schoolteacher, her gentle demeanor and dedication to her students earning her affection from those who knew her. She had a knack for sewing, crafting costumes for her school's Greek dance group, a nod to the vibrant Greek community in Collingwood. Together, the two women shared a bond forged in their small-town roots, their lives intertwined in a city that promised opportunity but hid darker possibilities. The house on Easy Street was a modest affair, its weatherboard exterior peeling slightly under the relentless Australian sun. Inside, it was a place of warmth, with mismatched furniture and the clutter of young adulthood, books, records, and Gregory's toys scattered about. The women lived with an openness typical of the era, their front door often ajar, their blinds rarely drawn. It was a different time, as retired homicide detective Peter Hiskick would later recall, a time when people trusted their neighbors and felt safe in their homes. But that trust would prove to be their undoing. On January 10th, 1977, Suzanne and Susan were last seen alive, their laughter echoing through the house as they went about their evening. 3 days later, neighbors grew uneasy. Gregory's cries, faint but persistent, carried through the walls, a sound that tugged at their hearts. Concerned, they entered the house and found a scene that would sear itself into their memories. Susan Bartlett lay near the front door, her body riddled with 55 stab wounds, a testament to the ferocity of the attack. In a bedroom, Susan Armstrong was found, her body bearing over 20 stab wounds and signs of sexual assault. Miraculously, Gregory was unharmed, alone in his cot, his small world untouched by the horror that had unfolded around him. The discovery sent shockwaves through Collingwood. Police swarmed the scene, their faces grim as they cordoned off the house. The community, tight-knit and unaccustomed to such violence, gathered in hushed groups, whispering about the brutality that had invaded their quiet street. The Easy Street murders, as they would come to be known, became Victoria's most notorious cold case, a puzzle that would confound investigators for nearly half a century. At the heart of the investigation was a young man named Perry Carumblis, a 17-year-old who lived just 300 meters away on Bendigo Street. His name would surface early, linger in the shadows, and resurface decades later in a dramatic turn of events that would take the case across continents. Perry Carumblis was a lanky teenager in 1977, his dark hair and quiet demeanor blending into the tapestry of Collingwood's Greek-Australian community. The son of Greek immigrants, he grew up in a neighborhood where Greek culture thrived, its influence evident in the local churches, cafes, and social clubs. Perry was a student at Collingwood High School, where Susan Bartlett taught, and though their paths had crossed, there was no indication of a deeper connection. He was known to be a bit of a troublemaker, his youth marked by minor run-ins with authority, but nothing that suggested the capacity for the violence that had occurred on Easy Street. Yet, 2 weeks after the murders, a chance encounter with police would cast a long shadow over his life. It was Ron Iddles, then a junior constable who would later become one of Victoria's most respected homicide detectives, who stopped Perry near the crime scene. In the boot of Perry's car, officers found a knife in a scabbard, a discovery that raised immediate suspicion. Perry claimed he had found the weapon near railway tracks under a pedestrian overpass, a story that seemed plausible but unsettlingly convenient. The knife was logged as evidence, but without the forensic technology of today, it was impossible to definitively link it to the murders. Perry provided an alibi, and with no concrete evidence to hold him, he was released. The investigation churned on, exploring countless leads and interviewing dozens of suspects. But the case grew cold, the answers slipping further out of reach with each passing year. Suzanne and Susan's families were left in a limbo of grief and unanswered questions. Gail Armstrong, Suzanne's sister, carried the weight of her loss, her memories of Suzanne's vibrant spirit clashing with the horror of her death. Martin Bartlett, Susan's brother, spoke of the women's shared history, their childhood in Benalla, and the dreams they had carried to Melbourne. The families clung to hope, supported by a community that refused to forget. The Greek-Australian community, in particular, felt the loss deeply, as both women had been embraced by its warmth. Susan's students, like 18-year-old Charlie Alexopoulos, remembered her kindness, her dedication to their dance group, and the costumes she sewed with care. The murders were a wound that refused to heal, a reminder of the fragility of safety in a world that seemed increasingly uncertain. As the years turned into decades, the Easy Street murders became a legend of sorts, a case that haunted Victoria police and fueled speculation among crime reporters and amateur sleuths. In 2017, 40 years after the killings, the police announced a $1 million reward for information leading to an arrest, a signal that the case was far from forgotten. Advances in forensic technology, particularly DNA analysis, offered new hope. Cold case detectives, led by figures like Detective Sergeant Paul Rowe, revisited old evidence, retracing statements and re-examining the knife found in Perry's car. The investigation zeroed in on Perry Karumblis, who had left Australia for Greece in 2017, shortly after being asked to provide a DNA sample. His departure raised eyebrows, but Greece's 20-year statute of limitations on murder charges meant he could not be arrested there. Perry's life in Greece was quiet, unremarkable to those who knew him. He lived with his brother Andreas in Athens, working as a welder and maintaining a low profile. His Facebook page, public and unguarded, showed a man living a normal life, sharing photos and even his mobile number as recently as 2021. His brother Tony, back in Melbourne, insisted Perry was innocent, a sentiment echoed by friends like Phil Akers, who had known him for years in Dandenong. "I'm 100% sure there's been a mistake," Tony told reporters, his voice heavy with disbelief. But the police were undeterred, their investigation bolstered by a DNA match from a family member that allegedly linked Perry to the crime scene. An Interpol red notice was issued, and the net began to close. On September 19, 2024, Perry Karumblis stepped off a Sky Express flight from Athens to Rome's Leonardo da Vinci Airport, unaware that his past was about to catch up with him. Italian police, acting on the Interpol alert, arrested him as he disembarked, a moment that marked a turning point in one of Australia's longest-running cold cases. Held in Rome's notorious Regina Coeli prison, Perry faced a grim reality: overcrowded cells, limited medical care, and the weight of accusations from across the globe. His Italian lawyer, Serena Tucci, described him as distressed but cooperative, expressing surprise that he had not been arrested in Greece. Perry consented to extradition, a decision that puzzled some, including international law expert Alexandro Maria Torelli, who called it absurd given the age of the case and the challenges of ensuring a fair trial after nearly 5 decades. The extradition process moved swiftly. By late November, the Italian government approved Australia's request, and on December 2nd, Perry boarded a Qatar Airways flight from Rome to Doha, then on to Melbourne, flanked by Victoria Police homicide detectives. One of those detectives, Dean Thomas, head of the homicide squad, sat in front of him, a silent reminder of the case's gravity. A journalist on the flight, seated just rows away, observed Perry eating a chicken pie and watching Rocky Balboa, his demeanor unremarkable yet jarring given the accusations against him. He landed in Melbourne at 11:32 p.m. on December 3, 2024, 13 minutes ahead of schedule, stepping onto Australian soil for the first time in nearly 8 years. The following day, Perry faced the Melbourne Magistrates' Court, his appearance a stark contrast to the teenager he had been in 1977. At 65, he was bleary-eyed, his white beard and disheveled hair giving him the look of a man worn by time. Charged with 2 counts of murder and 1 count of rape, he sat silently in the dock, his gaze fixed forward as the families of Suzanne and Susan watched from the gallery. Gail Armstrong, her eyes burning with a mix of relief and anger, admitted to giving him a dirty look. Martin Bartlett, quieter but no less affected, spoke of the hope for closure after decades of pain. The court hearing brief, with Magistrate Leon Fluxman ordering Perry to remain in custody until a committal mention on February 26, 2025, when a brief of evidence, including thousands of pages of DNA analysis, would be reviewed. The courtroom was a crucible of emotion, the weight of nearly 50 years of grief and determination palpable. Victoria Police Chief Commissioner Shane Patton described the murders as an absolutely gruesome, horrific, frenzied homicide, emphasizing that there was no expiry date on such crimes. The breakthrough, he said, was the result of advances in technology and the relentless work of detectives who had never given up. For the families, the arrest was a surreal milestone. Wendy Selkrig, Suzanne's niece, spoke of her aunt as a brilliant person, a mother whose life was cut short in its prime. The image of Gregory, unharmed but alone in his cot, lingered as a symbol of the innocents caught in the crossfire of violence. As the case progressed, the evidence against Perry began to take shape. The DNA match, derived from a family member, was a cornerstone of the prosecution's case, though its specifics remained closely guarded. The knife found in Perry's car in 1977, once a tantalizing but inconclusive clue, was re-examined with modern techniques, its significance still a matter of speculation. The prosecution planned to call 19 witnesses for a 6-day committal hearing set for October 27, 2025, a process that would determine whether the case would proceed to a full trial. Perry's lawyer, Bill Doug, a seasoned criminal defense attorney, requested time to review the extensive DNA evidence, a task that promised to be monumental given the case's age. Outside the courtroom, Collingwood had changed in the decades since the murders. The suburb, once a working-class enclave, had gentrified, its terraces now home to young professionals and artists. But the memory of Easy Street lingered, a scar on the community's collective psyche. The house at number 147 stood as a quiet reminder, its current occupants unaware of the horror that had unfolded within its walls. For those who remembered, the case was a cautionary tale, a reminder of a time when trust was taken for granted and innocence was shattered without warning. Perry Corumblis, now in a Melbourne prison, maintained his innocence, a stance supported by his family and friends. His brother Tony, speaking to media, insisted the arrest was a mistake, recalling Perry as a normal person incapable of such violence. Phil Akers, a friend from Dandenong, was dumbfounded, describing Perry as open and calm, not the type to hide from justice. Yet the evidence, painstakingly gathered over decades, painted a different picture, one that the courts would now scrutinize. The families of Suzanne and Susan, while hopeful, remained cautious, aware that justice, even after so long, was not guaranteed. The Easy Street murders were more than a crime. They were a wound that had shaped lives, families, and a community. For Suzanne and Susan, the vibrant young women who had dreamed of bright futures, the tragedy was a theft of potential, a loss that rippled through generations. For Gregory, now a grown man, the murders were a shadow over his life, a story he had pieced together from the fragments left behind. For the detectives, like Paul Rowe and Ron Iddles, the case was a testament to perseverance, a reminder that some truths, no matter how deeply buried, could be unearthed. As the case moved toward its next chapter, the questions that had haunted Collingwood for nearly half a century remained. Why were Suzanne and Susan targeted? What drove the ferocity of the attack? And could justice, after so long, truly bring closure? The answers lay in the future, in the evidence yet to be tested, and the stories yet to be told. For now, the memory of two women, their lives intertwined in friendship and ended in tragedy, endured as a call to remember, to seek truth, and to honor those whose voices were silenced too soon.